as you see, MTV did have an impact on the music industry and mattered. So I want to invite down my two very patient author friends, Craig Marks and Rob Tannenbaum, who wrote what I think is a fantastic book. I guess one of the highest compliments in publishing you can get is if your book is then put into paperback, which I guess is happening this fall.
Would you like it, Steve? Just anywhere?
Yeah, just pull up a seat, have a bottle of water.
Hello.
So this is Craig, that's Rob, and they were kind enough to schlep out from New York tonight to spend a few minutes with you guys. And
Thanks for sending the limo. That was nice.
Well, anything on behalf of Willie P, as you guys know. The book. What was the reason? I mean, you guys just woke up one morning and said, "Hey, this would be a good idea for a book."
Well, now we've been we're of the age that we, in some ways, have been prepping for writing this book for a long time. Most of our teenage and adult lives. The book is set between 1981 when MTV launched, and the end of the book is in 1992 when The Real World debuted. So in some ways, we consider that the beginning of the end of a certain part of the video era. From 81 to 92, MTV almost exclusively played nothing but music videos, with some exceptions. So that's what we wanted to concentrate on.
I had spent way too many hours lying on the sofa watching music videos, so this is a way of kind of justifying wasting all that time, turning it into like, hey, I wasn't just screwing around, I was researching a book.
So it struck me, and I'm sure it struck most of you as you read the book, the unique way, the format of the book. I know you talk about the inspiration, but maybe for the benefit of everybody, you could explain, rather than you telling a story in a historical way, the way you did it, what was the inspiration to do it that way?
Well, the book is told in the form of an oral history. So in the course of the 18 months that we were working on the book, Craig and I interviewed more than 400 people. And then we took those interviews and chopped them up, edited them, separated them, joined them, rearranged them, and set them into a chronological narrative. The oral history, we didn't invent the oral history. It's there are a couple of books that we had both read that we really love. The two main ones, though, are History of Punk Rock, written by Legs McNeil and Gillian McCain, specifically New York punk rock, which is called Please Kill Me, which, if you have any interest in punk, is a great book. And there's also a book that was written by Jim Miller and Tom Shales that was about the creation of Saturday Night Live, and that's called Live from New York. Those same two guys, Jim Miller and Tom Shales, last year wrote a book about ESPN called Those Guys Have All the Fun, which was a bestseller and was optioned for a film.
So we like the oral history format because it allows us to let the interviewees essentially tell the story for us. And while there's an art to putting it together, in the case of the people that we interviewed who were artists, lots and lots of musicians, people like Steve who worked at MTV, people in the music industry, directors who directed the videos, producers who produce the videos. These are all people who are generally speaking, are very good storytellers. I mean, musicians are, they're good raconteurs. So by getting them to tell the stories and then sort of letting them tell the stories and letting different people tell the same story from their own perspective, hopefully we built a nice little narrative and you are able to really get a pretty keen understanding of what it was actually like being there, working on these videos or working at MTV during this era.
In total disclosure, yes, I should have said in the front that I did work at MTV for 4 years, so I am guilty.
And you're in the book.
Yes, I'm in the book. So there's a couple of questions. Some of the students, after reading the various chapters, had come up with some questions. I just wanted to throw them at either one of you. Amina asks, why would record companies think it's stupid to use promotional money for videos? Videos are a great way to get promotion. Anything that someone can see at the moment is great promotion.
That's a good question. Well, when MTV started in 1981, there was no such thing as music videos for the most part. There maybe were 150 or 200 in existence anywhere. And they were used for, labels would, if a band was going to tour, or if a band was going to launch their record and they were doing promotion in Australia and the label couldn't afford to fly the band to Australia, they would send these promotional clips to these far-flung territories and use that in lieu of an actual live appearance. So most of the music videos at very start were mostly performance videos, just get a band in the studio lip-syncing their song. A couple bands started to do more creative videos. In some ways, the first video was Queen, I'll answer the question in a sec, was Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody from like '75, I think, where there was something a little bit more conceptual going on. Labels spent the money on these videos, not a lot at first. Maybe a video cost $40,000 or $50,000 at most, and they were just kind of sitting around their offices, and there was no real place in the U.S. for them to be seen, outside maybe of a few local cable, public access channels. So the labels at first figured, okay, we'll give them to MTV, pretty much for free. There was some arguing, but they kind of didn't mind giving them to MTV because they had no other real receptacle for these videos. And then they saw that they were actually helping to sell records. That's when labels started to realize that there was really something going on, because right away in certain, like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, there's a story in the book where Rod Stewart and Duran Duran and a Flock of Seagulls, especially Duran Duran and a Flock of Seagulls, these new wave bands, whose videos were being played on MTV, and where MTV was carried in these small kind of rural areas, these artists were selling records, even though there was no radio stations playing their songs. There were certainly bands were not performing anywhere near Tulsa, Oklahoma. The only reason they were selling records was because MTV was playing their videos. So labels caught on, started to put more money into the videos. So the labels weren't really reluctant to fund the videos. What the labels wanted was some piece of what MTV was earning from these videos, because MTV was building a huge fortune selling advertising on their cable network, and MTV wasn't paying the labels anything for the videos. There was no royalties being paid. There was just no money going to the artists were selling records. The artists were paying for the videos along with the labels, but the labels themselves, outside of the receipts they saw on the sales of the record, they weren't getting any money. So at a certain point, the labels forced MTV basically to give them some very minimal, really, payments. We'll give you a couple $1 million per year for the exclusive right to play your videos, and you promise that you'll give us a head start over any competition that we either do have or may have in the future. So if Ted Turner, which he did, tries to start a rival network to MTV, MTV had a 30 or 60-day exclusive, and that pretty much put Ted Turner and others, put Ted Turner out of business and prevented anyone else from really trying to compete with MTV. So the labels, the continued complaint with the record companies is that MTV built a huge fortune off of their backs, off of their investment in these artists. They paid for the videos, MTV played them, and MTV made millions and millions and billions of dollars in advertising from those videos. And they still complain about it to this day. I mean, now the labels complain about MTV because MTV doesn't play music videos anymore. So now everyone complains.
I don't think there's ever been a business model like that where a company is created that doesn't even pay for their own inventory. You know, MTV lost a significant amount of money when they were starting up. I think it was somewhere in the order of $50 million. But once they began to turn a profit, the profit was gigantic because they had such little overhead. And imagine if Apple Computers was selling computers that someone else had made and paid for, and Apple got them for free. It was all profit margin for MTV.
And I think in some ways when Napster came along, to the record companies, this was, to some bigger extent, so a little different. It was MTV all over again. It was another company that was looking to make tons of money off of the financial and sweat equity of the record industry. And they'd already gone through this to some degree with MTV.
Got another question here. Ray asked, during the course of the book, did any of the interviews with the musicians you did for the book contradict your idea of the vitality of MTV?
You know, for the most part, I would almost say to the contrary, that the artists, their nostalgia for MTV and their anger towards it too, just both prove how deeply indebted they were to MTV for the success, and then maybe later on how deeply resentful they were toward MTV for MTV's moving on to some other artist. I mean, when, you know, there's a certain, Rob writes this in the introduction to the book, if you look at artists now from that era who, Duran Duran, Bon Jovi, Van Halen, Madonna, Guns N' Roses, these artists still sell out arenas, if not stadiums. And I think, you know, outside of the quality of their music, the principal reason is because of MTV. And because of when they got played on MTV. They got played on MTV in the 1980s when there was no competition, not just for MTV, but essentially for a teenager's attention span. There was no internet. There were barely any video games. There was, you know, what else was there to do but watch this cool new channel play these music videos that, you know, that had never been seen before. So it monopolized teenage culture like, you know, I don't even think a Facebook or a Twitter, you know, in some ways really compares to the impact that MTV had. So any artist that went through that era recognized how crucial MTV was back then, especially for their success. I mean, they really could, you know, make or break any artist. And when certain waves of music came along, when hip hop came along, you know, it was crucial for these hip hop acts to finally to get MTV to play hip hop. It took a really long time, or a fairly long time, but when it happened, it changed hip hop. When grunge came along and to some extent knocked out some of the hair metal acts from the MTV playlist, those hair metal acts still feel it in their heart to this day how much it hurt when MTV said, you guys are no longer cool. It not only hurt their egos, but it killed their bank accounts. So I think for the most part, the acts were all, you know, they recognized the role MTV played. I don't think anyone really was, you know, there are acts like, there are 70s acts that we interviewed, like, I mean, people like Billy Joel, who I think rightfully they say they would have been just as big, or they would have been nearly as big if MTV had not come along, which is probably true, but they also recognize how MTV helped them sell more records than they had, you know, the 5 years earlier. And then there are some acts whose careers were, who never caught on to MTV, acts from the 70s, who never quite recovered.
We were just watching that TRL video, and the power that TRL had was probably a little more focused than the power MTV had in the 80s. But TRL was on, what, 1 hour a day? MTV was on 24 hours a day. And so in some ways, its influence on the music business was bigger than TRL's, just because there was more of it. And in the book, there's a quote from Kevin Cronin, who's the lead singer in REO Speedwagon. They were one of the bands whose careers predated MTV. And if you were around before MTV, you looked at a little, why do I have to make music videos? When did this become part of my job? And the musicians from the 70s tended to treat it with suspicion and distaste. They did it because they had to do it, as opposed to musicians whose careers began after MTV, and they understood that this was part of their jobs. But Cronin kind of summarizes the attitude, both of the pro and the con. He says in the book, if you were on MTV, then you were cool, and your record sold, and you loved MTV. And if you weren't on MTV, then you f***ing hated them. And you know, really, no one was neutral about MTV. And that's one of the reasons I think that the book was so much fun to write. No one was kind of in the middle of the road about the network. There are people who think that music videos ruined rock music for an entire generation. and there are people who think that it was the most fun era of music.
And that music was ruined when MTV stopped playing music videos.
Yeah.
Your Kevin Cronin quote echoes a conversation I recall John Oates, Paul and Oates said. He said, growing up, you learned your craft, how to play your instruments, how to write songs, how to sing. He says, then I got there, and then I found out, now that I have to do all that, I also got to look good.
Right.
Yeah, I think part of the problem for John Oates was that he didn't look good. That's, no offense to him, but, he was not a particularly...
Telegenic?
He didn't look great in the videos.
And MTV made visuals paramount, or at least, I would say paramount, if not co-equal to what a record sounds like, which is still a divide among music fans and people who make music now. And Bob Pittman, who is really in some ways the creator of MTV, said also that he thought that, and he's right, I think, that MTV changed the way people saw live performance. That the kind of spectacle that you see now when you go to an arena show or a stadium show, the dancers and all the lights and all that, and all the multiple screens, part of that comes from music videos and what the visual expectation that people have now of what an artist is supposed to look like and how they're supposed to present themselves. It was no longer good enough just to stand there and play a guitar, in front of a crowd.
Nope. This is a question, and opens up a whole other area, but I'd love you guys to comment because we can explain a little bit more about the process. But this is from Sam. It says, how does a video jockey pick which video to play? Since there's so many musicians sending their music videos to MTV, do some videos just never receive airtime?
The video jockeys don't choose the videos to play. The programming department does.
And actually, not only that, the VJs aren't there when the video is being played. So it's 3 days before, let's say it's Monday and they're taping for Thursday. The VJ would come into the studio and have a list of the videos that were going to be played that day. The list was prepared by the programming department. And okay, you need to introduce this video and then back introduce these 2 videos. And all those segments were pre-taped and then broadcast as though it was happening live. But almost nothing on MTV was ever live.
And there's, the people who ran, the small handful of young executives who ran the programming department or the talent department at MTV in the 80s and 90s were probably among the 5 most important people in the music industry. They really did have an awful lot of power. They determined which videos got played, and just as importantly, they and some other people determined how often the videos got played. It was done through research. It wasn't just stick your finger up and decide what you like. And it was, but the relationships between them and the record industry and the video promotion people in the music industry were keys to artist success. They can make or break, like I said that before, it's true, they can make or break an artist or a video. And they enjoyed their power, and they took advantage of their power sometimes. And there's someone in the book says being in the music department of MTV in the 80s was the best job in the world, and it really was. And there's all kinds of stories in the book about the lengths that record companies went to get their videos played, and artists went to get their videos played on MTV. And there is no single place like it now. There's no equivalent in the music industry to this day where if this guy or woman decides to air our video, we know we're going to sell 100,000 records this week. There's no such single place, which may be for the better, but it's certainly different.
And in fact, Steve, after a little while, MTV figured out that the position of being in charge of programming was so important that they wouldn't allow those programming people to have any contact with the music industry because they didn't want them to be influenced. And so there were sort of 2 separate programming departments at MTV. There was there was what was called talent and artist relations, and those were the people who, if you worked at a record company, you could call them on the phone. Where I'm sending you our video. This is a really important record for us. Can you come have lunch? Can you come to the show? And then there were the people behind the curtains And there was really a Chinese wall. The people at the record companies didn't know who the people were making the decisions because they didn't want them to be talking to the record labels. They didn't want those executives to be making decisions based on, well, we owe so and so a favor. They wanted it, and it didn't exactly work out this way, but they wanted it to be purely, this is what the audience wants, this is what we're going to give them.
And to get back, what Steve's job was, someone who worked with the VJs were essentially hired monkeys who read off the teleprompter, much like DJs are on the radio, which isn't to denigrate their job, but they're not the people deciding what gets played. They're just following a script and projecting a friendly face to the viewer so that the viewer has some human way to recognize that there are people here and we're just a family and we're just talking at you and we're hanging out. But I'm sure even Carson Daly, he didn't really choose the videos that got played. He was hired to read stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the more fun things for me was I was allowed to participate in those meetings, and so they did divide the labels up. Each label knew who their representative was. So I was kind of, in the beginning, the conduit to bring some of the information back to the VJs as to, what this video was like, because we'd eventually get them a reel of all the new videos, and they'd sit and watch them, so they'd be familiar with them. But the process and the selection and the way things were discovered, added, or dropped was quite an interesting process.
Mm-hmm.
I was very fortunate to be part of that. Rebecca's asking a question here, guys. Were the artists of the late 80s and early 90s making such controversial videos for their own self-expression, or to keep the music videos more popular than the non-music programming that was making a rise on MTV?
For the most part, the artists didn't have that much to do with their own videos. There obviously were artists who were exceptions to those rules. They were generally the ones who had the biggest hits for the most number of years, and therefore accrued the most amount of power or influence over their own careers. But if you were watching a Madonna video, you weren't really watching a Madonna video. You were watching a, oh crap, what's her name? Mary
Lambert.
Mary Lambert video.
Or David Fincher.
The videos were, a video was a director's medium. And the musician was just sort of the actor or the actress, the main character in a 4-minute movie. When a musician had a new record and there was going to be a video, the person who worked at the record company, who was in the video department, would sort of put out an open submission. We're going to do a new Bon Jovi video, and we're looking for treatments. The treatment was usually a 1-page synopsis of what the video was going to be. And those ideas were pretty much decided based on the idea in the treatment, the director's previous track record, how much money he or she wanted, and then it was up to the director to deliver that video in also what was a pretty incredibly short period of time. A lot of the videos were made in just 2 days, and typically a work day would go 24, 28 hours in a row. And this is another recurring theme in the book. A lot of the musicians began to resent the fact that they were secondary players in their own videos, even though typically half of the money, half of the cost of a video, they were paying for. But the directors had most of the influence artistically.
And to address the point in the question, MTV typically, most of the things they succeeded with were, if not accidental, were happenstance. So when MTV, for the first 2 or so years of MTV's existence, they didn't play any black artists on MTV, unless you were in a rock, unless you were one of the 2 or 3 black artists who happened to be in a rock band at the time. MTV didn't want to play your music, and it wasn't until Michael Jackson came along with Billie Jean in '83 that MTV finally, under I think, pretty substantial pressure from the record label that Michael Jackson recorded for, that they decided they would play Billie Jean. And then eventually they played Beat It, and then they played Thriller. And Thriller was really the most important music video of all time, and it changed MTV's fortunes. MTV not only went from playing Michael Jackson a little bit to playing Thriller every hour on the hour, and saying, coming up in 10 minutes, coming up at the top of the hour, we're going to play Thriller again. And every hour they would play Thriller, and it got them their biggest ratings ever. And then so they didn't, it wasn't like, we're just going to start playing, we love Michael Jackson, and we know this is going to be huge. They just kind of stumbled into it. Their hand was forced. The same thing happened with hip hop. They weren't going to play, hip hop had been around for a while. They didn't really think their audience would identify with it. A young producer named Ted Demme, story goes, Steve knows this well too, and they're somewhat conflicting remembrances of the same story.
Unbelievable reading the book. I mean, 3 people see the same thing, and they have 3 different versions of that story.
Right, well, it's a long time ago. So.
And it's also, it's usually in the case where something has succeeded.
Right.
If something was a failure,
Invention.
nobody says, I did that.
But Ted Demme, he said, well, I want to do this hip-hop show. We'll play rap videos. They said, you're crazy, it'll never work. He said, please, let me try. They said, no. They said, please. They said, all right, if you just shut up, you can do it. We'll give you like Saturday at 2 in the morning. You can do an hour worth of hip-hop videos. But it's not going to work, so don't be too sad when it gets no ratings. And of course, it got huge ratings. It got their biggest ratings ever. And within a month, they were playing it every day, and the show, or playing it in the afternoons, and then soon it was on all the time.
14 hours a week.
Right. When MTV started programming The Real World in 1992, originally they had done a couple of scripted shows. They did a game show called Remote Control in 1987. That was really their only non-music related show until The Real World. They had a couple of comedy shows, but nothing that really was on every day or even every week. They wanted to do a soap opera, a scripted soap opera, like you'd see, One Life to Live or whatever. But they couldn't afford it when they found out how much. MTV was notoriously cheap. They wouldn't pay for anything.
Except Adam Curry.
Except Adam Curry. And so these television producers said, what if we try it without a script and we cast real people and we just turn the cameras on? It'll be much cheaper because we don't have to pay actors, we don't have to pay writers, and let's try that. And there was a couple of shows there was a show on PBS, a documentary show that was sort of like that. And so MTV said, that sounds great. We'll get some kids and we'll put them in a studio apartment in the city. And the ratings were great. MTV had no idea it was going to explode. And so to get back to the question, when artists were making controversial videos in the early 90s, they really had no consciousness that The Real World was the beginning of the end for them. They had no idea that MTV was about to go into the reality television business, and that The Real World would eventually breed Snooki in the situation. MTV didn't know that either. MTV had no idea. They just, if it got ratings, they'd make 10 of them, and if those 10 worked, they'd make 20 more. And that's the freedom that MTV has in a way. They're not a big network like CBS. They don't have to invest in all these scripted programs that take so long to develop. They can just kind of put something together a lot faster, and MTV will try 20 different shows still. They'll just try new shows all the time, and if they get a nibble, they'll double down on it. That's the way they do business.
All right, here's a question from Melody. Jane Weedland's comment in Chapter 1 gives an accurate description of the reason MTV and music videos gained so much popularity, as did the artists that promoted them through their videos. However, can it be argued that videos drew people to change their entire personality and style because of what they saw their idols doing?
Of course.
Yeah.
Rob dressed like Madonna for...
I still try to.
Sure, I mean, the same way that, people saw Ed Sullivan, Elvis Presley on Sullivan, or the Beatles, and changed their life. I don't know if there's, I think Thriller changed people's lives.
Are people dressing like Snooki today?
Today? Probably. I went to a bat mitzvah not long ago, and it seemed like all the 13-year-old girls were dressing like Snooki. So I think yeah, I think television has that power, and music has that power, and then if you combine the two, it's very powerful.
We also, in the course of the book, started thinking about the number of different industries that were influenced by MTV, and it's just about everything: fashion, Hollywood, independent films, television, news reporting specifically. What else?
Advertising, did you say that?
Advertising.
Literature.
Yep. There really wasn't a field in media that wasn't altered by MTV.
You know, if you guys, if you get through the enormity of the book, about 2/3 of the way through, a couple of people introduced these film directors. One named Michael Bay, who did the Transformers movies, and David Fincher, who did Social Network and Seven and Fight Club and Girl with the Dragon Tattoo. And they're just two directors who got their start making music videos. So in the 1980s, making music videos, while not a means to an end for these very ambitious directors, was the coolest thing you could do to get your start in the film business. Because you can make these little mini movies, you can get a decent pile of money to do it, and you can establish your chops really fast. And so, you know, I mean, I think in a lot of ways, David Fincher and Michael Bay are probably the two most important directors working in Hollywood today, and really each has shaped the way that movies look now more than anybody else. And they both got their start making terrible videos, and some good ones too. But Michael Bay's first video was a Donny Osmond video. And Michael Bay, and Fincher made videos for The Outfield and Loverboy and bands that you're lucky enough not to have ever heard of. So it was a huge stepping stone.
Question here from Christine. Do you think if Madonna's videos for Like a Prayer and Justify My Love were released in today's society that they would have the same reaction from MTV as they did when they were initially released? What do you think society today is more accustomed to seeing shocking images such as those?
Well, I thought of Madonna when you asked us the earlier question about controversial videos. And in the book, we argue that the golden age of music videos is from 1981 to 1992. That doesn't mean that there weren't great videos after 92. There were lots of them. But in terms of density, the videos were better from 81 to 92. And one of the things that kind of started to go wrong was that there was this sort of arms race of sexuality, controversy, and provocation.
And spectacle too, I think.
Yeah. This was especially true for the hair metal bands. And someone in the book says you would do, one week you'd do a video and the band would have 2 helicopters and 300 lights. And the next month you'd do a video and the band would want 10 helicopters and 1,000 lights. It all accelerated so quickly. How do you continue to do sexually provocative videos? MTV wasn't showing full nudity, so there is a line that you can't cross. And once people have gotten really close to that line, how do you continue to make videos that are bigger, more attention-getting, more controversial, more provocative? Eventually, the ideas just kind of ran dry.
Okay.
There's only so many times you can have a burning cross and a black Jesus with bleeding stigmata.
Madonna used to enjoy testing our standards, and she would do quick flash cuts in the video of her various parts of her anatomy that were not supposed to be shown on cable television.
There are people in the book who said their entire job was watching hair metal videos in the standards and practices department or at labels and checking for nipple slips, because directors and artists would always try to like sneak one in,
right,
if they could.
That was a job in the 80s, looking for nipples.
Yeah, there was actually a woman who was in charge of standards and practices, and I would always have to have conversations with her.
Michelle Von
I was
Feld.
dealing with it. What?
Michelle Von Feld.
Yes. Yes, and she had the strangest sense of humor about her job, but it was always rules about, particularly with the hip-hop videos, about guns.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Guns was a problem. And the saddest one I had was some independent video, used a lot of stock footage and intercut it with the band shoveling money, cash, into a burning furnace. And they thought that was funny, except what Michelle pointed out is burning money is a federal,
It's a federal offense. Yeah.
and we could not sanction that. So there was always something to pay for. Andrea wanted to know, what do you think is the most important event that occurred that brought MTV to where it is today?
Well, that's a good question.
Today is, I mean, I do think that the three that are covered in our book, which I think probably continue to be the most important events in MTV, were outside of the starting of it. There was the book is named after an advertising campaign that MTV ran when it was in 1982, when it was teetering on the brink of collapse. They couldn't get, back then, cable wasn't as widespread as it is now, and it wasn't, you couldn't get cable television in every neighborhood, and where the wires were laid, you had to kind of beg and cajole the carriers to allow them to get them to pick up your channel. So, it wasn't like now you go anywhere in the country and you assume that everyone has cable and everyone has ESPN and MTV and CNN. Back then that wasn't true. Not everyone had cable, and everyone who had cable their cable carrier didn't necessarily have MTV. And the most important thing was for MTV was to get distributed. They couldn't sell advertising if they couldn't reach viewers. And so with I Want My MTV, they came up with this very audacious campaign where they got artists, very famous artists in those days, Mick Jagger, David Bowie, The Police, to go on and do these free commercials for MTV, say, call your cable operator and demand your MTV. So it was audacious because they got these artists to do these things for free, which normally an artist would charge $1 million to do. And secondly, they went around these cable operators who were nervous about carrying MTV, because MTV played music videos, rock videos, which were degenerate and had sexuality in them. And so they went around these people and got the people in those communities to call their cable operators and kind of demand their MTV, and it worked. So that solved a huge problem for MTV. Then I think Thriller was, Billie Jean and Thriller were monumental for MTV. They made MTV realize that MTV was started by a bunch of guys who were in radio before. The executives in MTV were not from television, they were all from radio. And they were from FM AOR radio, which meant that they played Lynyrd Skynyrd, Freebird, and Led Zeppelin, time after time after time for white suburban males, basically. And they wanted to replicate that format for television on MTV. And they really stringently thought that that was the way to go. And that if you played any artists who weren't exactly like that, you were going to alienate your viewers. And when they played Michael Jackson, their ratings exploded, and they realized that television was a much bigger medium than radio, and it wasn't quite as segregated. And that not only would people not stop watching, but they would bring in new audience, and it wouldn't alienate the old audience, and the old audience actually liked Michael Jackson. And then the other turning point was The Real World, which was was not only crucial to MTV, and it enabled them to stop playing 3-minute videos one after the other and play a half-hour show. And that's important because if you're trying to sell advertising on MTV, you need to tell the company who's going to advertise that the viewer is going to watch the whole program. When they played 1-minute video after another, people would treat it like radio. They would just change the channel if they didn't like the new video. And not only did The Real World change the fortunes of MTV, but it obviously, if you've watched television lately, there's an awful lot of reality television programming on there. It's cheaper than scripted, and every television network subsequently, all the biggest ratings are from reality television.
Goes into this question Corey poses. I read in section 3, one of the chapters that pertained to MTV moving into more than just music videos. You wrote that the ratings had gone down due to just playing music videos. Do you think they made the correct decision today, since MTV now, for the most part, plays reality shows or reruns of TV shows from other networks.
The most important lesson that MTV learned early on was that they couldn't feel a sense of religion about any particular direction. And this is really in contrast to the record companies, which are now in such terrible financial circumstances, partly because they never wanted to change. It's to MTV's credit that they were committed to constantly changing. And it was difficult emotionally for a lot of people who worked at the network, which had been created around this radical idea of music video. We didn't mention this earlier, but the creation of MTV in 1981 was so bizarre that at that time, the music video wasn't a phrase. If you went back to 1981 and said to someone, do you want to watch a music video, they would have no idea what you were talking about because the phrase didn't exist. MTV was showing a product for which there wasn't even a name. And so having started this way, a few years later, it was really, people at the network had a personal, emotional commitment to the way the network had started. But they saw that financially, any half hour of videos that they showed, no matter how good the videos were, no matter, and MTV was constantly readjusting, we'll play a little more hip hop, we'll play more metal, we'll play more women. No matter what they did to the music videos, a half hour of videos got smaller ratings than any half hour show. And it became a really simple financial decision. Like any other network, programming decisions aren't based on what the programming executive likes or thinks is quality. It's based on what gets us the most number of viewers so we can charge the most amount of money for advertising. So I think Craig and I both feel a sense of nostalgia for the era when MTV played music videos. The last chapter in the book, there are a lot of people who grew up in the era or became stars in that era who say, oh God, I wish fuck MTV, I wish they still played videos. But there's no doubt that MTV made the right decision in abandoning music videos. And in terms of a business story, it would probably be good for a lot of businesses to work more along the MTV model of we're not tied to a specific product. MTV realized that they weren't a music video channel, they were a youth culture channel. And that's what allowed them to survive, was having the broader definition of what their mission was.
Just a comment, either one of you can handle this one.
Snooki it deserves.
Stephen Levy from Rolling Stone said, MTV's greatest achievement has been to coax rock and roll into the video arena where you can't distinguish between entertainment and the sales pitch.
Well, two things. First of all, Rolling Stone hated MTV. From the day that MTV came on the air, for the next, I'd say at least 4 years, Rolling Stone regularly attacked MTV in the pages of the magazine.
You think that was one of the reasons maybe they hired Kurt Loder to sort of a peace pipe and say, we'll take one of yours?
I don't think so. It's ironic. Kurt was one of the Rolling Stone writers who was most vociferously opposed to MTV. When I was researching the book, I went back and I read a lot of old Rolling Stones. And so you all know that Kurt ended up being the face of MTV News, starting in '87. Does that sound right, Steve?
Yeah,
more or less 87.
I remember auditioning again.
Yeah. But in '84, '85, yeah, Kurt would review a record, and completely unrelated to the record would say, you know, this album by Joe Grishecki and the House Rockers is full of great, passionate rock and roll, not like the kind of crap you see on MTV. So he was just taking these pot shots at the network.
MTV was really like, in some ways, the first great sellout for artists. Now there's essentially nothing an artist won't do to get attention. There's nothing that's too essentially it's too gross for an artist to do to try to sell their concert tickets or get their face and music in front of people, because everything's so split up. There's no, everyone's a gatekeeper now that you kind of have to do everything. But back then, MTV was considered a pretty, a commerce-driven thing for an artist to do. To make a video was to sully yourself. And that's what Rolling Stone and other cultural gatekeepers then were rebelling against. They thought it prized flash over substance and looks over musicality, and other kind of high-low divides like that. But artists can't afford to make those, for the most part, make those distinctions anymore.
Dan asked a couple of questions, but the one that stands out is, do you see a possible additional network designed to specifically play music or to specifically play reality shows as a future business?
Well, I know that Diddy just is launching a channel called Revolt, I think,
Yes.
which I believe is going to be an urban music video channel.
And he's hired former MTV programmer Andy
Schoen. So, not just he, but whoever's financially backing his network believes that there is room for, I guess, a resurgence of music videos. I'd be surprised if it wasn't modeled. I don't know if anyone here remembers a network called The Box that was on for a little while, but that was very TRL-like, where you would call in, and I think it was 900 number maybe, and you'd select a video to play, and that video would literally play, and if that's how it was programmed by the viewers. I'd be surprised if there wasn't a lot of interactivity like that through social networking, probably, for Revolt. But and I don't know if it's going to work. I seriously doubt it, actually. But someone's betting that there's a counterweight to all this reality programming on MTV. There are enough artists who will occasionally chirp about, even younger artists, that MTV doesn't play music anymore. I think Timberlake says it sometimes. Adam Levine from Maroon 5 has said it. Every so often, an artist, will bark that MTV abandoned music and how dare they. So maybe there's enough of a minority, of a vocal minority, to get music videos played on MTV, or on a television. Certainly, the experience of watching a music video on YouTube, it does not compare to the experience of watching a music video on television, especially now with HD and all these 50-inch TVs. Music budgets for music videos, when we did interviews for the book, have almost come full circle. So what labels spent on a video in 1981 is once again what they spent on a video in 2012. So it went from here all the way up and then came all the way back down. So I don't know if labels are spending enough money in some ways to make really great music videos that will look good on big TVs. Who knows?
Diddy's got that Ciroc money, though.
Yeah.
He can afford to lose $5 million. That's.
I'm sure it's not his money.
Yeah.
I think somebody had a question?
On that note, I have a question.
Sure.
On the television, there's all those channels all the way at the top on my TV.
The music choice?
Music choice channels. Do you see a station like that incorporating music videos into their just music, instead of just playing a song and having little facts about the artist and just play the music video of that?
Well, I don't know.
I think, the business model for music choice is very small, narrow niches. So if you like big band music, or if you prefer Sinatra-era music, and so a lot of that stuff there aren't videos for. And then, of course, for them to do that would require them to be limited to the repertoire that exists. So that would be one. And two, whatever exists, they'd have to license.
Right, it would cost a lot more.
It's going to change. It's going to change their business model. Right now, they just are paying rights for audio usage. If you combine video, it's going to be a whole different game.
I have to think that there really isn't a market these days for music videos, because
Well, what a shame.
with the expanded digital bandwidth on cable systems, if there were a market for it, someone would have figured that out by now and launched it.
I think probably the
Huge.
assumption is that you can watch any music video you want whenever you want essentially on any device you want.
Yeah.
Why would you sit in front of a television and wait for someone else to make that decision for you as to what you should be
Discovery.
watching? Yeah. Well, yeah.
So Joseph asked a question very aligned with this. What are the implications for the artist-fan relationship post-MTV? Do you think YouTube has become a suitable medium for video, or is it a Band-Aid? Do you think another video curator-esque channel would arise?
One of the smartest people I was able to interview for the book was this guy named...
Steve?
No.
Not
Not the smartest, obviously.
in addition to Steve.
In addition to Steve was a guy named Cliff Bernstein, who's the co-founder of a management company called Q-Prime. And they managed Metallica and Def Leppard, and they managed Smashing Pumpkins, and they're about the biggest rock management company in the
And they also have new and up-and-coming bands like Sleigh Bells.
Yeah.
And so-
And if you ever get a chance to see the documentary about Metallica called Some Kind of Monster, which is one of the great rock documentaries, Cliff looks like Yoda. He's got super long hair, and he's gray long hair.
And big beard.
Right. But he said that, and he's smart and does a lot of research, I think. And he said that on YouTube, one thing about MTV was that because they were playing the videos for you, you kind of had no choice but to watch new artists that you weren't used to, you never heard before. So they'd play a Guns N' Roses video, but then maybe right after that they'd play a Gin Blossoms video or some other band that you knew not of, and all of a sudden you came to like the Gin Blossoms. On YouTube, almost, I don't know what the percentage is, but the vast majority of videos that people watch are by bands that they already know. So there isn't that sense of, it isn't a discovery mechanism. It's a mechanism so you can watch Justin Bieber's Baby for the 200 millionth time. So I think I can't exactly remember how the question was phrased, but I don't think there is that same, you don't discover new videos on YouTube or via the internet the way that you used to from a network like MTV.
So do you think there could be a channel that
See,
curates?
the thing about being able to consume what you want when you want is that you do that. And so most likely you cut out the process of being kind of spoon-fed something that you didn't know you wanted.
Can you guys even imagine watching TV without a remote control? Because that's what all of us
Or even a
grew up with.
DVR. No.
Yeah. You turned on the TV and you sat there, and if a commercial came on, you didn't click through it because you couldn't. And we're now we live in an on-demand world. MTV was not on demand.
Question from Marco, what can MTV do to reestablish itself as the king of youth programming, or do you feel that MTV has reached its peak?
Well, I don't know if it's not. As far as television goes, I guess it's by default the king of youth programming. I don't think that anyone believes. I'm not even sure MTV believes that they have the kind of hold over youth culture that it did. Obviously something like Facebook or Twitter or whatever, or Pinterest probably has a little bit more of a hold on the popular imagination. MTV's essentially like a major label now. It's a hit business. Jersey Shore saved MTV's bacon. They were dry. That's why that show will, situation will have to jump off a building and Snooki will have to, there's nothing that can stop that show from airing except for those people to quit the show, and even then they'll probably reanimate them.
Just think of when she gives birth. I mean, that's
Front cover of People magazine?
That's an entire season premiere. Snooki gives birth.
So, MTV enjoys the biggest ratings they ever have because of Jersey Shore. I'm sure they're sweating the idea that show will, eventually not be there anymore, or will start to subside, and then they need to come up with another hit. But it had been since The Hills or Laguna Beach, I guess, had been the shows before Jersey Shore that were big. You know, that's what it's about at MTV. They need one franchise hit to hang their hat on.
And one of the ways in which things have changed, a show like Remote Control, which was a really big hit at the time, it started in 87. After 3 years, MTV took it off the air. They'd pretty much done everything. The ratings were still good, but MTV was still in a state where they wanted to keep things new and fresh. They wanted to preempt the audience from getting tired of anything. And someone in the book says, Jersey Shore won't go off the air until the ratings die. And that's probably true. It may be that a couple of the people in the cast become so expensive that MTV needs to get rid of them. But they'll just be replaced. And Jersey Shore will go on until viewers decide they're sick of it.
And interestingly, MTV does have a conscience, even though you wouldn't necessarily think so. You know, I think shows like Teen Mom are MTV's way of trying to be socially conscious and relevant, you know, in comparison to, you know, the kind of trashy junk that is Jersey Shore.
Is Silent Library socially conscious?
I don't think so.
Nathan asks, well, you know, we can all agree MTV is no longer music television. It doesn't show videos like it used to or really any worthwhile programming, in his opinion. Do you see a resurgence in music videos on networks like MTV, or are we doomed with Jersey Shore type shows?
I mean, I think the replacement for MTV is The Voice and American Idol and X Factor. I mean, music is still the Voice is the #1 TV show in America. You know, so music on television still is monstrously huge. It's just been packaged in a different way. You know, they've combined music and reality television, and you know, Simon Fuller and Cowell created American Idol, and that was a juggernaut. And now The Voice is, you know, kind of supplanted that as the #1 show. So it's not that music and television have gone away. It's just taken on a new form. I mean, music videos probably as a kind of art form, you know, has probably seen its better days.
Well, Sean asks that he's referring to Chapter 1, where you mentioned all of the famous artists and their initial reactions to participate. You mentioned, you know, that the endorsements without getting paid. Do you think, that MTV was the greatest thing in the world at the beginning, and what do you think of it today? Personal opinion.
Yes, it was great, and now it's not as good. Nothing ever is.
You have a story about the first time you saw MTV.
Yeah, I was selling pots and pans door to door in college, and I walked into someone's house and they were playing MTV in Philadelphia. I couldn't believe it. But you know, that's partly because MTV was synonymous with music videos and vice versa, and it's the music videos that were really the thing that dazzled me and that I fell in love with. I mean, MTV was just a network. You don't really form, you still don't really form an emotional connection with a television network, but you did with Madonna's videos and with, you know, Def Leppard's videos and with REM's videos. It was a new way of experiencing music and getting to know artists. That's why MTV was so important.
And radio playlists were so restrictive that it gave you the opportunity to discover new things and become emotionally attached to them and identify.
That's another part of the story that it's a little bit difficult to explain to you guys, because you grew up with so much choice in programming. But when we grew up, there were 3 or 4 AM stations, 6 or 8 FM stations, and from year to year, they were all playing the same music. I grew up in Connecticut, about 40 miles outside of New York City, and listened to New York radio stations. In those days, the rock stations were WPLJ and WNEW. But this was true pretty much all around the country. You could go from city to city, and in a given hour, you'd hear Freebird and Stairway to Heaven over and over.
And those songs were 4 years old by then, at least.
Yeah, well over 4 years old. There was very little being promoted in the way of new music. And when MTV started, it wasn't as though they loved A Flock of Seagulls or were committed to Duran Duran. there just weren't videos for Stairway to Heaven or Freebird. If there had been, MTV would have been playing them out the ass. But they really were placed in a position where they had to play what was available, and what was available was usually new music.
So, a bunch of students sitting here tonight, listening to the three of us pontificating the lint on our navels. But so why should they care about MTV? Unless they're fans of Jersey Shore, of what relevance does any of this have to contemporary music industry, which is where I assume most all of you have expressed that's why you're here. When you leave the hallowed halls of Willie P., you want to be involved in the entertainment, specifically music business. So who cares? I mean, you guys wrote a wonderful book. I can put it on the shelf in the library and say, this is what that was. Of what import or relevance is this to folks here?
There are two books in our book. The first book is what we hope is a really entertaining romp about the 1980s, when there was a huge amount of money floating around the music business, and the video business was being created. Everyone was high. Everyone was drunk or on blow all the time, blowing money, making terrible decisions. If you like books about rock stars on coke and midgets on coke and rock stars on coke doing videos with midgets, then
It's the best book ever.
this is like the Moby Dick of that genre. But the second book inside the book is kind of an MBA story. It's the story of an industry that made some good decisions, some bad decisions that they ended up making the best of. And it's really an illustration of how, especially if you're in the media business, but if you're in any business at all, how you survive and adapt and prevail over whatever hardships have been put in your way. There are some examples of things that you'll want to imitate, and also some examples of things that by all means you'll want to avoid. And the same way that, it's a pretty big claim to make for the book, but the Walter Isaacson book about Steve Jobs and the creation of Apple, there are a couple of reviews that made a little bit of a comparison, that this is the story of the creation and success of an industry that no one believed would be successul. It's just that, as opposed to the Steve Jobs book, ours has more stories about rock stars on drugs.
And to that, I would add that the lessons you could take away, or a couple lessons you could take away from the book if you're interested in getting into the industry. One is that you not only shouldn't you be afraid of the new, but you need to embrace the new. MTV was, and those artists were about, cable television was brand new then, and no one, and that's another part that we haven't really talked about, but anyone who went to work for MTV was essentially laughed at by most of their friends or their peers, because they were, back then you would get cable television by walking into your hardware store and ordering it. I mean, it was such an infancy of the industry. So these people were really taking a great chance, if they had any other opportunities, by going to work, not just for a music video channel, but by a cable television channel. And then everybody, the people who got rich, essentially, were people who were smart enough to recognize that industry and this network as a fresh and exciting and visionary idea. And there are plenty of people who scoffed at it. So that's one thing, and that's constantly being thrown in all of our faces now, that there's always a new technology. And not everyone pans out, but keeping your mind open to that is extremely important. And then from a slightly more musical perspective, I think that the importance of visuals is something that MTV cemented, and that's also incredibly valuable. That if you manage an artist, how good they sound is only one piece of the puzzle. And maybe not even the biggest piece. There's an entire way that people consume music. It's not just an audio experience, it's a visual experience, and it's how those two things work together. And I think, which isn't to say that there's not artists who don't, who can't sell lots of records by going against the grain. They don't all have to be sexy, they don't all have to be great looking, they don't have to put out in that way. But keeping that in mind and being smart about that, and smart about how you present yourself is still paramount, and you can't ignore that.
Okay, you got a question, sir?
I thought it was really interesting the time period you guys focused on, like stopping in 1992 with the starting of the real world. And I was wondering, we see that like after 1992, also there's this huge thing with TRL, and like it's almost the first time you look at social media, where it's like social media, but from a smaller thing. But it was almost the birthplace of that, because I remember like watching MTV. I used to watch like Control Freak, where it's like you would vote for what you wanted. Would you guys ever be interested in doing maybe a follow-up book on the following decade of MTV, or do you think that your interest only spans that?
I think we'll hopefully you won't hold this. You won't remember us saying this and then laugh at us when we actually do a sequel. But I think we'd prefer not to. I mean, we spent so much time arguing that this was a golden era for music videos, if not for MTV, but certainly for music videos. That we do believe that. And if now we started saying, well, we were just kind of kidding. We really like the '90s better.
Actually, now that we've thought about it and been offered a book contract,
TRL is really the one exception. I think that was, a fascinating period. I think the documentary that Steve showed, I think lessens the import of the boy band teen pop era and its role in TRL. I mean, I think the TRL decade was probably really like the 2.5 years of TRL, and the rest was just kind of filler in the front and the back. And I think without the teen pop phenomenon, TRL would never have reached that point. And the point about it being kind of an TRL was, I don't know how genuinely so it was, but it felt interactive, where the audience really did get to demand what they saw. And so it was kind of a forerunner of YouTube and things like that, where it was a customized experience for the viewer. I think that was important. And that audience, that teenage, I edit a pop music website now called Pop Dust, and one of the reasons I wanted to start it was because that audience, especially like a young female audience, can be so incredibly passionate, more so than any other audience out there, except maybe for the weird metal dudes who have nothing better to do than to call radio stations all the time and request, their favorite System of a Down or whatever. But young female, music fans just are crazy passionate, and if you can engage them somehow, and the right kind of artists come around, they will spend all day long calling or voting or filling the streets of Times Square. And the synchronicity between teen pop and TRL was pretty mighty.
Any other additional questions? I'm sure I can persuade these guys to stay here for a few more minutes after class. So I want to take the opportunity to thank them for schlepping out here from New York City, or from Brooklyn to be specific. Obviously, you've seen the book and you know what it's about. So cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for your attention tonight. Thanks for sharing your moments with us.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you, gentlemen.